Okay, so for our first activity, we're going to spend some time together reviewing and clarifying Greenblatt's ideas. So your goal as a group is to make sure that everyone in your group leaves with a real mastery of what Greenblatt means, particularly by constraint, mobility, and exchange, and a solid grounding in how Greenblatt argues that literature engages with these concepts and uses these concepts to comment on, perpetuate, critique, challenge, question culture. So, with that in mind, the first thing I'd like you to do is use your laptop to enter Canvas and go to Module 2, Activity 2.1. From there, I'd like you to use your annotated text that I hope you brought with you to class today, and anything in Canvas that helps, to review the three big concepts: constraint, mobility, and exchange. You're welcome to talk about anything else in Greenblatt you want to, anything else that caught your attention or seems problematic. But I want to make sure that by the end of this discussion, you're solid on the big three, so to speak. Um, so, uh, I want to just quickly talk about exchange because I know that most of you will have a pretty good grasp on constraint and mobility by working together. And from what I've seen in the discussion, and from what I've seen in the discussions, you already do have a pretty good grasp. Where things get a little dicier for folks is exchange. So what does Greenblatt mean by exchange? Well, the classic example he gives is marriage. Marriage is a form of cultural exchange. Two families connect with each other. A man and a woman make a permanent commitment to each other. It's a kind of social contract. It's a social ritual. It's a social practice. And for Greenblatt, it's a great example of a symbolic and cultural exchange that we could talk about. So anytime there's a marriage in a work of literature, that's a clear moment of exchange, and you will be reading just such a moment at the end of part one of Sula. But sometimes the exchange isn't as formal. For example, sometimes the exchange is in a relationship. So we could talk about Nell and Sula and talk about what kind of exchange is going on in their relationship. What do they give each other? And what kind of cultural codes and forces do they represent symbolically? And how does Morrison use them to comment on those? The same could be done with Helene and Nell. Uh, Again, how is that relationship symbolic of an exchange that goes on in a culture between people, between groups of people, between values and ideas? So we can think of exchange as a formal exchange. We can also think of exchange as a relationship. And then we can also look for exchange in sort of an informal moment in a narrative. And a good example would be Helene's experience on the segregated train, the Jim Crow train in the South. And I think we see in that scene a really good example of the larger point Greenblatt wants us to think about, which is we can understand an author's relationship to a culture by seeing how they depict and comment upon an exchange. So clearly, Morrison is appalled by the humiliation Helene endures on the segregated train. She's also saddened by Helene's willingness to subordinate herself to the white conductor, and she's also alarmed by the way that subordination separates Helene from the African American men observing her on the car. So this would be an example, I think, of Greenblatt arguing that an author uses an exchange to critique the impact of, in this case, racism on a culture. In other words, by symbolically analyzing the exchange, or by analyzing the symbolic exchange, we actually get an insight into what the poet or writer, in this case novelist, is saying about a cultural theme: racism, gender, class, and in our case, human agency. So those are three examples of exchanges that we can think about. Formal exchanges like marriage, relationships like Nell and Sula, or moments like the confrontation on the Jim Crow train. Each of those is an exchange of a different type that Greenblatt would argue the artist has created to get us to symbolically unpack the dynamics of the culture and the vitality and health of the culture. And clearly Morrison sees racism as highly problematic in American culture, especially for African Americans who are so acutely limited and oppressed by it in the time period that she's writing about. So I wanted to, before you jumped into your groups, share those reflections on exchange. Now, as you go through these three concepts, constraint, mobility, and exchange, in your groups, something you might want to do at the end, after you've looked at Greenblatt and really gotten a hold of it, something you might want to do at the end is discuss a popular movie or TV show where you see one or more of these dynamics. They're core ideas in television and movie texts as well. Greenblatt's focused on literature and the use of language and imagery to communicate symbolically cultural ideas and dynamics. But those same things apply in television shows where you have visual framing, imagery, costuming, dialogue, sound, so many other tools, movies as well, same set of tools. So it can be fun and interesting at the end of your conversation to think about a popular show or movie and apply the ideas there as a way of testing how well you've got a hold on them. And sometimes applying them to a movie or TV show helps you come back to Sula with new eyes. Hope that helps, and I look forward to hearing how your conversation goes.